And the last complication is what I call system change because it's on an even bigger scale. So here we're looking at essentially a video which shows the generation and movement of moisture around the world hour by hour for an entire year. I will not take you through the entire year, but you can see that most of it is generated over the oceans and near the equator. And if you look at the far right, you'll see moisture coming off the tropical Atlantic and entering the Amazon basin. And there it continues to be generated because of the presence of forests. So the Amazon forest literally makes half of its own rainfall by a cycle within the basin. And that ultimately is vulnerable to climate change and also to deforestation. And so we are seeing the first signs, I think, of the possibility of Amazon dieback from a failure of that system, a major drought in 2005, and an even greater drought in 2010. And there's no question that Amazon hydrology decline is one of the contributing factors to the terrible drought affecting the megacity of Sao Paulo. So if you lose a big chunk of the Amazon forest, you lose a large part of the world's biodiversity. You lose a huge amount of carbon stored into that forest. And of course, the livelihoods and welfare of anybody living there is severely affected. The other great system change is something that science literally missed until about 2005. And that is, as the ocean absorbs some of the excess CO2 in the atmosphere, some of it turns to carbonic acid. Simple high school chemistry, but we all missed it. And so what we have, in fact, is an ocean system today which is 1/10 of a pH unit more acid than in pre-industrial times, which sounds trivial, but it's a logarithmic scale, so it means it's 30% more acid. It's already affected oyster beds, for example, in the northwest of this country. And it's important because there are tens of thousands of species which build skeletons or shells from calcium carbonate. That depends on an equilibrium, which is both temperature dependent and pH dependent. And that's getting harder and harder. So a lot of those species we know about. Certainly we think about oysters here. But there are a lot of them we don't know very much about, or very few people do, including these tiny little organisms called sea butterflies, which are tiny little snails, the foot of which is modified so they can flap like little wings and maintain itself in the water column. Go on, start. There we go. Charming little things, but they're teeny, and they exist in the gazillions, and they're at the base of food chains in the North Atlantic and off Alaska, and they're already showing signs of being affected by ocean acidity. So basically, what I'm trying to build up to here is to make the point that the 2-degree target agreed upon internationally to stop at, or probably, or maybe even stay below, is actually too high. It's too high for biological systems. It's too high for ice systems. It was basically chosen because people thought it was doable, not because it had any intrinsic merit. So that's one of the myths that has to be busted if we are to end up in the right place. And you only actually need to know one fact, which is the last time the planet was 2 degrees warmer, the oceans were 4 to 6 meters higher. I don't think we want to go there. Certainly Virginia Beach would not want to go there. So what might in fact be an okay or safe level of greenhouse gases? So pre-industrial levels was 280 parts per million. We're now at like 400. Jim Hansen and some others of us are beginning to think 350 is where we should try and aim, and we're way beyond that. So what in heaven's name are we to do? So that's when I turn it over to Dr. Planet. And Dr. Planet has made his diagnosis, and now he's prescribing various actions that we could take. One of these involves conservation strategies. How do you adapt to the climate change that's already happening and which is hard to avoid? Then how do you limit increase of greenhouse gas conservation concentrations? And lastly, is there a way to take CO2 back out of the atmosphere? So it divides into two pieces, mitigation, reducing the amount of greenhouse gas emissions, or even taking it out of the atmosphere, and adaptation, how do you cope with the change that's already taking place? So for conservation strategies, we already touched on the need to increase connections, make it easier for species to move more towards a model of human ambition embedded in nature. And obviously anything we can do to reduce other stresses is a way to avoid negative synergies with the climate change that will take place. And a good example of an adaptation and mitigation project altogether is to restore natural flow in South Florida. It not only provides protection against storm surge, it also builds up coastal wetlands which accumulate carbon. So there's a huge energy agenda in all of this, which I will not go into, and it's not my expertise, but that doesn't mean it's not hugely important. And what most people are unaware of is even today, somewhere between 15 and 20% of the annual emissions of carbon dioxide come from destruction of ecosystems, primarily deforestation in the tropics. So that's something actually that one could get under control. And Brazil has made some real progress on that in recent years. And so we end up with this equation that we actually might think about playing with in a good constructive sense and changing. So every year, 5 times as much carbon goes in the atmosphere from the burning of fossil fuels, which is just ancient ecosystems, as is released by destruction of modern-day ecosystems. Half goes into the atmosphere, a quarter into the land, a quarter into the oceans. So the question is there some way we can play with this literally at a scale that will affect climate change? And it's a really important thing to do because greenhouse gases stay in the atmosphere for a long time. And if we're able to pull some of it out, we can pull it out before it has accumulated enough radiant heat to actually force climate change. So what we might do with ecosystems is really important in this. It's not enough. We need to find other non-biological ways to remove CO2. But the good news is the planet has actually done this twice in its history. Twice in its history, there have been screamingly high levels of CO2 brought down by biological processes to pre-industrial levels. The first was with the arrival of plants on land, and the second was with the arrival of modern-day flowering plants doing it all more efficiently. The only problem is that took tens of millions of years. We don't have tens of millions of years. But the good news here is that there is a significant portion of excess CO2 in the atmosphere that's actually come from 3 centuries or more of destruction of modern-day ecosystems. And it is perfectly possible to do ecosystem restoration at scale and take maybe half a degree worth of impending climate change back out of potentially being caused by CO2 levels in the atmosphere. In many cases, it has other benefits as well. So a big piece of it is how we manage forests and reforest and where we do that. But another piece of it is also about grasslands and grazing lands. And what happens when you restore degraded grasslands or grazing lands? You get better grazing. And what happens when you alter agricultural practice so instead of leaking carbon, the systems accumulate carbon? You get rising soil fertility. So the restoration agenda, ecosystem restoration agenda, is actually a sensible thing to do in its own right. And there is a relatively new piece of this, which the Commonwealth of Virginia is in a great position to contribute to, which is known as blue carbon, restoring degraded coastal wetlands. So altogether, by working with forests, grasslands, agricultural systems, and coastal systems, it is in fact possible to reduce the amount of climate change, make it easier to add 2 billion more people to the world, and feed them without destroying more nature, which is perfectly possible, and in the end, basically make the planet more habitable for humans and other forms of life. Thank you very much.